evening and welcome to the Brilsey talk in the series World Affairs. Tonight we're very privileged to have Simon Tyler, who is a project and mission management with Médecins Sans Frontières. Now, for those of you who are not fully conversant with the work of Médecins Sans Frontières, it is an international medical, humanitarian organization working in more than 65 countries in the world. They act fast to save people's lives, not only in conflict zones, natural disasters, but also in epidemics. There is also a side to Médecins Sans Frontières who works in advocacy to raise awareness and to create debate and to act as witness or témoignage, and to protect life and health and restore respect for the individual. Now, turning to tonight's speaker, Simon Tyler has spent the last 20 years working in remote regions of the world. He began life as a conservation biologist. He managed large research and development expeditions, especially in Central America and Southeast Asia. He has contributed to protected area management. Now, Simon later on moved over to humanitarian sector and specifically to project and mission management with MSF. Since 2008, he's worked in Darfur, South Sudan, Pakistan, Nigeria, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Myanmar, and latterly as head of mission in both emergency response and longer-term medical and humanitarian management. Simon will address us on the challenges in delivering humanitarian aid to people in need across the world. Welcome this evening, Simon.
Thank you very much, Penny. And yeah, thank you everybody for having me here tonight. I'll add a little bit more an up-to-date bio on my current status, because I'm very aware that everybody is seeing probably in the corner of my screen the letters MSF India. Now, I am based in Bristol, and I am in Bristol, not in Delhi at the moment, but it's also part of the job I do currently. I'm providing management advice for the India office and more widely in the South Asia region, and also providing operational support for MSF UK as and when needed. So just so you're aware, I'm actually only 10 miles down the road. I'm not the other side of the planet. How I'd like to do this, I'll just, I've got a couple of themes to go through, but it's a nice little introduction. I'd like to just share with people a little bit about the international structure of the organization. I won't spend long, but I think it's useful to understand how vast it is and the type, the architecture of MSF. My role more recently has been as a head of mission, and I can share a little bit about that. And before I go into the actual crux of the discussion, problems in mission management and crisis management. So I'm just going to go to my, yes, sorry, Penny.
I was just going to say, now to all our audience, would you very kindly mute your microphones and turn off your videos so that we don't use up bandwidth, so we can all have a nice clear view of Simon's presentation. Thank you very much. There'll be a chance to ask questions using the chat facility when Simon's finished.
Perfect. Okay. So exactly as Penny mentioned, we'll take questions at the end. Please, you don't need to keep to the theme here. I'm open to any question you have about the organization, its history, what we do, its mandate, where we've worked. Yes, please do. I'm open to all sorts of questions. So I should last for about 40-45 minutes. We'll have a short video in there as well. So hopefully you'll listen to me continue to drone on.
There's a short video in.
Okay. I put this short slide in because I think sometimes it captures what we do. This was taken in 2015 in Unity State in South Sudan. It's actually a place that I ran the hospital here in 2010 for a year and a half. And these are queues of people, lines of people awaiting non-food item distributions, i.e. that being soap, buckets, tarpaulins, blankets, any items that are not food item or non-medical item. The comment, yes, it might sound a little precocious, but to be honest with you, it does resonate with the organization. We find the niche where the humanitarian sector sits. We find out where conditions are the worst. And when we say that, it is where others may not be. And that's the niche often. That's the space within the humanitarian response that MSF tends to find ourselves. That's where we aim to be, and that's where we go. So as I mentioned, a little bit about how we're going to plan this out. I'll share a little bit about the international structure. I think it's interesting to see just how we're put together. My role ahead of the mission is the senior manager for all humanitarian operations in the country. Just going to touch on a little bit about that, and it also brings in the coordination. Who do you have to talk to? What are the bodies? What are the coordination forums, for instance, in Pakistan that you need to engage with, in Syria that you need to engage with to ensure that aid is delivered on time and without duplicating what others have done. I then go into our interventions, and I've got 3 case studies that I'd like to share with people. Each one presents a different dilemma. Each one is different in its context, and each one is different in the fact that on paper you may look at it and think, wow, that's a small problem, but they can all have quite disastrous consequences if not managed appropriately. So I'm going to share those with people. I'll talk through a little bit of the context, and I'll also talk through how we got there. And then at the end, this is something that's obviously crept into MSF's management in the last 12 months. We did not used to be operational in some of the, when I say home societies, I mean the UK, I mean Ireland, I mean North America. Often we did not have operational footprint in these locations. It is more about our communications team. It's more about our fundraising opportunities and advocacy towards UK government, etc., on public health issues in the wider world. But last year, we embarked on our first operational response the UK has ever undertaken. And I think it's particularly relevant, and it still is relevant now, that we responded to the COVID response and therefore identified a small group of people that had fallen between the cracks, so to speak. So I'd like to just share a little bit on what we did, how we did it, and also some of the future thoughts on today, on how MSF may still have relevance today in the UK context. So this is the structure of MSF. There's no importance hierarchy here, but I think the center of this bubble is our international office. That is based in Geneva. Okay, so that is where they set the statutes, the bylaws, they grant the license for the use of the name. They're the gatekeepers for the organization. They're not operational. They don't send people to the field, but they actually are the lines of the 5 red rectangles around the outside of them. Those OCs are operating centers, and they are the only 5 offices that are licensed to run humanitarian operations. So Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, Barcelona, and Geneva. That is the current position as it is now. There is a move in the organization to try and break this Euro-dominated position up. And therefore, we're seeing West Africa come into the play. It hasn't been approved yet, but it soon will be. South Asia, an area I know very well, will soon come on board. The Middle East will come on board. So therefore, it allows a greater diversity and a much better representation of what we really do and the people we represent. The grey circle on the outside of that, they are our what we call sections. And you'll see the UK at probably 4 o'clock on your screen is a section. A section is an institutional office. It manages fundraising, it manages recruitment, advocacy issues, and sometimes technical expertise, sometimes a little bit of medical expertise. The UK office is one of the hub for certain UK medical innovation techniques. It's got a small unit there, a 40-odd, 30-odd strong team of international staff providing technical advice and expertise to all our field operations. But they are not operational. We do not run humanitarian interventions from those locations. And then we go to the further extremes, and then we have the smaller offices, of which, yes, they basically, there's just a lower tier on the structure. They're all linked. The lines aren't there because it become quite a web. But as you can imagine, the UK has strong ties to certain OCs. Ireland is part of the UK. It's quite a spider's web. Fundraising is dominated by all of these offices. It's a core function of all. And I think at the moment, we're very fortunate to be in a position where fundraising hasn't been adversely impacted. I think over 96% maybe of our funds at the moment is coming from private donors, which means it gives us financial independence. It means it's allowed to continue our core function of responding where needs are most, i.e. impartially, and we're not directed by institutional or funds tied to politics, which is key, makes MSF actually quite unique in the humanitarian sector. So somebody asked me this a while ago when I started to do these kind of presentations. What is the head of mission? What do you do? What's your role? Yes, you are the senior manager of the operations, all humanitarian operations in that country. But what is it? What's the one key attribute you probably need? And I thought about this, and I thought there can be any one, and it is all about communication, and that's internally and externally. It may sound obvious, but to be honest with you, it is the key function of this role. So the head of mission role within MSF, often you're sitting in Islamabad, you're sitting in Yangon or in Abuja, or in Erbil or Baghdad, or Juba. These are the locations. Our headquarters of a mission are normally based within the capital. Management plays a key role, and as with all big organizations, we love our acronyms. We have a country management team, a CMT, which is comprised of all of our senior staff. They can be from all nationalities, and that includes that. When I say all, I mean all. Even the country in which we work is not restricted. So we could I had a team in Islamabad, myself and 4 Pakistani nationals who were running that mission. It was incredibly refreshing, and it gave me a much greater and better insight into how to work in that context. The field incident management team basically deals with crises, mainly abductions. When an abduction of a staff happens, whichever one, whoever it is, the field incident team is established. It is headed up by the head of mission, and your sole job is to then ensure there's a communication link to whoever has taken that person, to also family, and also to other parts of MSF. It's a job you're trained for, and hopefully don't have to actually do. Evaluation and appraisal is a standard part of most people's management lives, and projects, because that's what we're about. The mission itself, the name for the whole structure, is obviously made up of projects, and these projects are based in the remoter areas wherever the need is greatest. The resource management, financial, logistical, and HR, they are all line managed by the head of mission. Financial, some missions often have a 20 million euro budget. Even though I'm not responsible for actually defining it, you are the end responsible. So I still need to have an iron scrutiny over these budgets and the way it's spent. Logistics, probably one of MSF's strengths and something we always bring to the table. It can be as exotic to running small light aircraft in the bush in Central African Republic and South Sudan, to running boats in certain parts of their missions. A logistical coordinator runs those. And of course, then our HR, some missions have in excess of 1,000 staff these days. So it is highly complex. Planning obviously makes a huge part of each mission. Our annual control plan and our spring control plan, we have 2 check-in moments like most people do. We set our budgets and we review to see how we're performing, of course. Our CMT is also an opportunity. Our country management team will meet probably 4 times a year, and at one point we will discuss strategy for the forthcoming year. Coordination days and strategic planning are also key events where senior managers will leave the field and join each other, sometimes in Middle East locations, where it's convenient for all, or sometimes in European hubs, where we have an opportunity not only to meet colleagues, but also to talk about best practice and to talk about these problems that we're encountering in the field. Representation, advocacy, and culture. Now, this is also probably the one thing that is heavily on the shoulders of the head of mission. Focal point for all communications and advocacy. Any communications that come out of that mission will normally have the heads of mission name on it. You will be responsible, you'll be the spokesperson for all engagements in that country. You will also be advocating for the conditions of your patients. You'll also be advocating to get access to them, as I'll show hopefully later in a case study in Myanmar. And culture. I write culture because you do set the tone. If you are open and accessible, you can provide the right working environment for everybody, and they do look at you when you have 1,100 staff in a mission. And the last point, I normally highlight this one in red because it's a little bit different to the others. MSF loves to debate. We love to talk to each other. We love to discuss and review and challenge each other to make ourselves better. But there's one part of the discussion that is not, and that is security. As a head of mission, you are end responsible for all security and safety of patients, staff, and donors in the country you work and beyond. So therefore, your word is final. If a team wants to go into northern Syria and you say it's too dangerous, they don't go. It's period. It is not negotiable. And it also comes down to having a good network, strong analytical skills, and also understanding the context. So all of these things together will provide you with, there's also a framework to work from, but the end point is security is not negotiable. The others, we love to discuss them, always. Coordination. Now, this is pretty much happens in most countries that we work in. And maybe I'll start at 12 o'clock and I'll work clockwise around. And this is what MSF is engaged with. Let's say as a head of mission in a country, this is what you are required to do. These are the agencies you're required to engage with. And at the top is the Humanitarian Country Team. Basically, that comprises of the UN and elected INGO, often 5. So 5 heads of other NGOs are elected onto this Humanitarian Country Team, made up of the heads of the UN agencies. And those 5 NGOs are elected. And there's 2 standing positions, ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and MSF. So we're there as standing observers. We're invited to every meeting, but we're not voted on. And that is also a sign of how much people appreciate our involvement on these forums. The cluster network in the field is, it could be the health cluster, it could be the logistics cluster, UNJLC, the Joint Logistics Cluster, and the health cluster, as I've mentioned. These are headed up often by UN heads, pardon me, but joined by all of the relevant agencies. MSF was, and the WHO were going to be the two leaders on health cluster. We have since stepped back somewhat and left the WHO to take the lead, but we're still heavily engaged. It provides strategic direction for these particular partners in country. Local community, of course, wherever you work, you have to be very conscious of the community. Ensure that you don't disregard their wishes, and also you ensure that you do keep people informed. And there'll be a nice study a little bit later on sometimes how you can try your best, but it doesn't always work. Civil society groups, again, also part of the local community. Often you partner with them. When you can't get access to certain places, they provide a very good, robust and credible local partner that you need to work with. Other INGOs. There's obviously INGO networks and forums. So as well as the health cluster, where similar organizations will come together, the other INGOs, we can always bond together in INGO forums, for instance. Donors, Department for International Development, ECHO, the European Fund, etc. Even though MSF does not take money from these organizations, we still engage. They still have influence. They can still influence policy in a country if we find it's probably not convenient to certain groups or ethnic groups have been marginalized. So it is also useful. And they will all come to MSF as well, because they want impartial, straight advice sometimes. Consular, the British High Commission, for instance, the US Embassy, they also play a role. But again, they have no influence over what we do and how we do it, but we don't ignore them. We do need to engage at certain times because there are benefits to this, as might be seen later. Other MSFs, I shared with everybody the slide of the 5 different operating sections. So if I'm working with one of them, I'll make sure I engage with the other 4. And they become our closest allies. We all know how we work. We all know what resources we can share between each other. And then local government, as well as federal government. It's last, but absolutely by no means least. The local government, the Ministry of Health are normally, most likely, our partners in country. We don't operate often independently. We don't threaten the sovereignty of any country we work in. We will always try and engage with the Ministry of Health at all times. So I've summarized a little bit about how we work in the field, and hopefully you can see a little bit of that as we start to move through some of these case studies. And these are real life, of course, and these are times that I have experienced. I'll share with one in Rakhine, in Myanmar. I was there for 2 years as the emergency coordinator. Now, this is before the large exodus in 2017, when the majority of the Rohingya Muslim were still based in Rakhine state in western Myanmar. I'll go through a small case study there, exactly some of the problems encountered. And this was quite a high profile event in MSF's history. There, in Unity State, I saw the picture at the beginning of the presentation. I was there as a project coordinator for about 1.5 years in 2011, based out in the South Sudanese bush, stranded in the wet season. Yeah, not so on the face of it, not such a big problem, but certainly ones that present dilemmas, shall we say. And in Syria, in 2016, I was a head of mission in Syria. And this one is an interesting tale about how to overcome barriers such as international borders, for instance. You will always find a way of being able to continue to provide healthcare and humanitarian support to those who need it. So I'll move on to my next picture, and we'll start to talk a little bit about Myanmar. Very topical at the moment, of course. I have to say what's happened recently probably came as very little surprise to myself and others who've lived and worked there for periods of time, but nonetheless distressing. But I'll just take us back 8 years to 2013, 7 years, 2014, when MSF worked there. When MSF was working there as in a mission. It was the largest mission MSF had at the time. We had 5 projects in Yangon, in Kachin, in Shan, Northern Rakhine State and Eastern Rakhine State. So Rakhine State had a very large operational presence at that time. We had 30,000 HIV patients in Myanmar, 30,000 patients. And this is in a country at the beginning of the decade, 2000, didn't even acknowledge HIV existed. And now they've grasped it, and 13, 14 years later, we have 30,000 patients enrolled. That's the highest cohort any organization had, even including the local Ministry of Health. A lot of these are vulnerable populations, migrant workers, sex workers, etc. And we were working, as you can see, in the extreme regions of the country, you know, where they were not actually treated. They were treated as kind of like ethnic minority groups. We had 27 primary healthcare clinics in Rakhine alone, 27 clinics providing primary healthcare to the local community. Now, a lot of that community tended to be Rohingya Muslim community because, of course, they were the ones who actually required that support in the first place. We had over 1,200 employees, of that, probably about 40 or 50 were internationals, and the rest were local from Myanmar. It's an interesting point to raise, but MSF was seen as a supporter of the Rohingya for many years. A lot of our programming was based in the west of the country. We did a lot of work there in malaria control and also TB and HIV in detention centers. So it's a massive program, huge program. A little bit of extra context, because this is where you get a flavor. And these pictures were nothing new to us who were working there. They might be new to some people outside of that part of the world. The long-standing ethnic divisions were between the Rakhine, and the ethnic Rakhine group are Buddhist. They made up 3.5%, and the Burma, which would make up the majority of the ethnic population of the country. There had been long-standing divisions between the two. They looked down on them. The ruling elite of the Burma, the ethnic Rakhine, were cast away in a small, remote part of the country and never really acknowledged. This was always a problem. And if you think out of that, you also have the Rohingya population, who after 1982 were not officially recognized and often referred to as Kala, a very derogatory term for the individual, for the population. But yet there were still 3 or 4 million people in that country who were Rohingya Muslims, but they were not recognized. And if you think of 136 ethnic groups in that country, some of those groups numbered 40 or 50 individuals, and yet 3 or 4 million people were not recognized. It was incredible. We'd been present for a long time, you know, for a long, long time. And we'd also engaged in, and I mentioned the cyclone, because in 2008, 140,000 people died because of Cyclone Nargis. And a lot of this was very preventable because at that time, the country was still under a military regime, and therefore access was denied, and medical support and aid was also often denied. So it was only later, when we managed to get access, did we see what was really going on. The 2 pictures I put up there just go a little bit of the way to show the environment that we were working in. The Rohingya, who were often vilified by the ethnic Rakhine and other community members in Myanmar, often were led by a gentleman in the middle named by Uwaratu. He'd been in prison for, I think, probably 10 years for hate speech. And when he emerged, a few years later, he finds himself on the front of Time magazine as the face of Buddhist terror. He grasped the social media as a way of influencing populations into violent mobs, of which I will share with everybody in a second. So a little bit about our problems there. The state is a coastal state. It's made up of islands. We had poor access for many years. The visa restrictions were well known. We couldn't always get where we wanted to. We're often using tourist visas to bring in work staff, which on itself is, of course, bending the rules somewhat. We also had little engagement with the Rakhine Buddhist community because of their perception of MSF. And if you think of all of our clinics were working in predominantly Rohingya Muslim environments, they thought that's what we did. We supported the Rohingyas. And then therefore the Rakhine Buddhist community really started to take quite aggressive stance against MSF as well. During some of the violence in 2012, we also had 2 of our staff were detained without charge. They were Rohingyas and put in prison. We mounted a 2-year battle to try and ensure that they release. And I mentioned Mingala because it was a small place within a city after a displacement that was isolated. It was an open prison in a town where Rohingya Muslims were living in Sitwe town. And it's actually on the image to the right, you will see the barriers and the guards. This is in the middle of a town, a small town in Rakhine State, but actually had huge divisions and also an isolated community of individuals within there. These were the Rohingyas. They weren't allowed to mix. And this was very much a government policy, but it was also threatened a little bit by the government there, by the Buddhist community. Some of our clinics were operated like the ones on the left. We're often doing mobile clinics on boats to remote communities. These are 2 of our medics in the village in the background. So it was an incredibly diverse mission, very, very diverse. But it also created some of the biggest divisions within MSF. So some of the problems, I've just detailed 5 key moments here. In Chopiu in the south, violence broke out in 9 townships. And MSF officers were searched for weapons, and the social media increased. So we even had the police coming into our office looking for guns, which sounds ludicrous. But again, it was on Facebook, so everybody believed it. The RSG, the Rakhine State government, asked us to open a hospital for the Rohingya because they felt too afraid to do it, but they felt that we would. So we were even asked at some point to do so, of which we duly obliged because we realized there was a need. We treated patients during the violence without authorization, unwittingly realizing that someone is in need of support. We support them. We didn't often realize you had to get approvals from the government to do so. And in 2013, we were accused, a lot of the community were taking a balanced approach. And this was a way everybody felt, could we find a way of supporting the Rohingya by providing the same to each side? The funny thing is, this also backfired when the local community, the Rakhine Buddhist community, said, but if I take a bucket, it means you give a bucket to the Rohingya, and that's not acceptable. This is the type of backdrop we were engaged in at the time. And in 2014, probably the critical moment in a small village in Duchiyatan, there was, and I put it in inverted commas, there was a massacre of approximately 50 people were killed. I visited the village literally 12 hours afterwards, and it was ablaze, and I opened our clinic next door. And we were then brought forward to ask to give testimony to say there was no massacre. Of course, we could not do this. We told them we had treated patients and people coming from it. Therefore, put us into direct conflict with the local government and the community. And just to also paint the picture, I also had a position where we had the local monks. One night I was having dinner in the town. They visited my house, and 40 of them, monks and supporters, actually entered the property looking, because the rumors in the town were I was holding Muslims in my house. So it's an incredibly tense environment to work in at that time. This is what we were finding outside our office in 2014, in February. It was huge demonstrations asking us to get out, mainly because of our perceived bias towards the Rohingya population. Now, of course, we only provide people who need care. It's impartial. It sees through religion and etc. But because of this, their long-standing position against the Rohingya Muslim, that was seen as too much. So in 2014, these protests continued abreast. At that point in February, we were suspended. It spent 5 days outside of the office. The local government requested to see me in their office, and their points were, we don't actually need your help anymore. I had to then call the office in Amsterdam. We had a 10 million euro program. We had 600 staff there, 27 clinics were open the next day. Every single one had to shut the next day. So going from probably the largest healthcare provider in the whole state to actually having zero the next day, mainly due to public pressure of the local community who did not really appreciate us supporting the Rohingya population. This is where the story starts. I then had to engage in rounds of negotiation, discussion, and it's all about access. It's all about discussion with the community, with the government. But 4 weeks after our suspension, violence broke out in the community. There was a mob that went around the entire town and ransacked every NGO property, every UN property, basically accusing us all of the same bias. So it wasn't just us, it was everybody in the end. In the end, myself and 2 colleagues stayed back. The rest of the international community had left, and we tried to rebuild our mission. And so really we were starting from zero in March 2014. It was a tricky time. We had nothing. We had 14 properties that we had to give back. We had cars, we had clinics, everything was closed. We had a medical store with €500,000 worth of drugs in it, ready to supply the community with, which we could not access. It was a very, very difficult time, especially as me being the head of the mission, the emergency coordinator. So these are some of the instances. The bottom right is actually outside the house I had. And after it was ransacked, the police decided to actually stop people accessing the property. The top right is actually a Red Cross property. So nobody was spared during this period. It really was a powder keg at the time, and everybody felt this. It really was quite intimidating, to be honest. I moved into the next phase of my job there. I had no operations. There was no there was no actual programs ongoing. We were suspended, but we really had to find a way to get back in and negotiate our way back. So the gentleman on the top right was the Deputy Minister of Border Affairs. He became the new Chief Minister. So they take out the old minister, they bring in the new one with the general, which sounds quite familiar. We became very close, strangely, because obviously I was a thorn in his side. I spent most days at his office discussing how we could return. And his comments were often, we need to talk to the community until they have accepted our presence. But we also did an awful lot of international lobbying, a lot. To the US Embassy, the US Ambassador provided strong guidance for us. But the one key moment, and I think is interesting, and it showed me a little bit of insight as to how I should communicate, was we provided a briefing to our UN representative in New York, who then went to the World Health Assembly in Geneva in 2014. He'd managed to get a briefing with the Minister of Health for Myanmar. When the Minister of Health met with our representative, he had a full list of the notes in front of him that I had sent. So at some point, they had managed to intercept my email with all of the notes and the talking points and the questions that I briefed our staff on to ask him. It was a wake-up call. There's no such thing as a secure communication channel, and therefore there'd been a breach. Now, when we heard this out, of course, we look around at each other, what can we do? Probably nothing. We just got to be sure that whatever we share, we know will be seen. So bearing this in mind, we continue to move forward. I held negotiations and presentations throughout the state. The bottom left is the state hall of Sitwe of Rakhine State, a place that I visited many times. And the key moment, there was one defining moment in December, and I'd had enough. I'd just about finished. I'd spent 8 months negotiating our access back, and I'd actually then decided to send a letter to our colleagues in Amsterdam to say, I think enough's enough. We cannot do no more. Time is up. And the decision at the time was, I said, I'm going to draw a line in this, and if we don't get an approval to restart our activities by the 17th of December, it's time that we actually start to engage our communications teams and start to advise everybody what is going on in this state. Not necessarily to us, but certainly to the Rohingya who are being persecuted in that state. So that was my position. I left it at that. And I got a reply from the state government, literally, to say we can restart activities on December the 17th. I got a call from my coordinator up in the northern state, part of the state, saying, Simon, didn't you send a letter to our own staff, our own colleagues in Amsterdam to say, this is our line, our bottom line? And then didn't you get approval to say we can start on the same day by the government? Now, I don't believe in coincidences. And again, it just shows that ultimately, yes, we learned that there's no such thing as confidential communication. And the other thing was we were honest. You know, we were open in our translation. I was happy to see that they'd probably seen my communications, and then therefore they had actually acted on it, because maybe behind the scenes there was some sort of a veiled threat, shall we say. Tricky time. 9 months it spent renegotiating access. Many people felt we should have stepped out and advocated for the better welfare and treatment of the Rohingya. I don't necessarily feel it would have made any difference, but it's a very, very difficult context to work in. And as we know now, it still is. It still is incredibly difficult, probably not more so. So really, lessons learned here were no such thing as transparent communication. And 9 months later, I was actually taken back by some of the senior managers in the movement who actually commended it and said that was probably one of the fastest pieces of negotiation to re-access a country they've seen, especially one as closed as Myanmar. So an interesting case study and a difficult time. And I want to just take us to a different place. I want to take us to South Sudan. In 2011, I was a project coordinator. Image on the left, typical scene of Lair Clinic in Unity State. It was one of the largest primary healthcare clinics in MSF at the time. It was vast. The clinic on its own had about 300 staff. It had been present for 25 years. It was held up as one of the long-standing clinic that actually anybody who joined MSF, most people passed through this place. You kind of like cut your teeth there. It was a hard place to work, but incredibly rewarding, super remote, and a massive, a huge integrated health facility. We even offered emergency surgery to those in need, and actually had an array of equipment. Now, this was always useful because at the time, often revolving around either tribes or cows were the two issues of the state. So often you found people coming in with spear and gunshot wounds, or often there were cattle rustlers, and that was also a problem. So people were coming in with injuries sustained there. So they were the two issues to kind of contest with. It was open 24 hours at all times, and it was a well-known facility. It was the only clinic for probably serving the population for probably 3-hour drive comfortably. So people walked for days to get there. This is going back a bit now. Things have changed. And the hospital and the project was run on solar power, which is great. But obviously it only has a limited capacity and certainly can't power things like an oxygen concentrator very easily, and then therefore run the emergency room. So we also had a generator. And other departments required biomedical equipment as well. So there was a huge drain on resources on those power structures, infrastructure, shall we say. So one day I remember, it was probably in that ward on the top left, which actually happens to be a Kala Azar ward. The doctor requested that the machine remained on permanently to support a juvenile with a breathing problem, a respiratory tract infection. Now, to leave the machine on, that's fine. And the oxygen concentrator we have in the field is one in the bottom left. But they're powered by the generator. And there's only one generator on site. And the consequences of that generator failing, with no emergency room available, then limited cold chain, i.e. our vaccines would all then have to be thrown away. Lighting would be less reliable. No other biomedical equipment could be used. This presents a problem when you don't have access to all the resources you need. So something as simple, a doctor having to make a key decision almost on whether a child can live or die. Now that's the extreme, of course, knowing that his decision, if he chooses one way, the child may not survive. If he chooses the other way and the generator breaks, we lose a lot more potentially. It was one of those decisions that we almost needed to take a decision amongst the team. Nobody really needed to shoulder that sort of decision on their own. It was one of those situations. So there's the dilemma. Keep the generator running to save the patient's life, but run the risk of breaking the only power source in the hospital, or turn off and manage that to ensure that all essential services will continue to function and no risk of power due to the generator failure. That's the conditions that you're faced with on a daily basis. It may not seem very much. It may not seem, the things we see, in the headlines, but these are the really tough decisions. These are the decisions that doctor was faced with every day. And therefore we had to find a compromise at some point. In the end, we did find a middle ground. We enabled the machine to remain a little bit, to run a bit further and a bit longer, but there was no way I could actually sanction the machine to run all night and run all day for days on end, and then therefore risk breaking that and then risk all other life-saving services in the hospital. Very, very, very hard decision to make, and one that doctors have to take on a daily basis. So that was a simple one, but the outcomes could have been quite severe, but it was quite a simple one. I move us forward a little bit in time, and this one was in Syria in 2016. Now, excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink for mine. Now, because of historically, before 2016 or in early days, you could access Syria, northern Syria, from Turkey. Now, as we know, Turkey is still a holiday destination, or was then. Visas were easy to come by, and you could travel comfortably down to southern parts of Turkey. And I'm not saying you could easily cross the border into Syria, but you could it was certainly a possibility. So we managed our mission in Turkey. One, because it's safer to do so than it is to be based in Syria, and you have access. So we could actually cross the border. Bearing in mind that the areas of brown to the right of the Syria map were occupied by Daesh, Islamic State, at that time. So we were operating projects in locations where Daesh were present. But the key thing to this is we had access, and it was permissible across the border. People were walking across the border from the small towns in southern Turkey into Kobane and other similar towns in northern Syria. So it made great sense. It was a 30-minute journey just to go and visit the clinic. You could see it from one side to the other. Interestingly, that is because Daesh was present. And just a little picture. So the top picture shows the open access from Turkey to northern Syria, which we could often go through. We're often standing in the queue, and people used to suggest that you didn't know who anybody was in the supermarkets in Turkey because they were all coming from Syria, and then therefore are they Islamic State? Maybe, but there was a certain balance there at the time. Then the Kurdish forces, with the support of US air support, started to move through the top part of Syria and push out the Islamic State. And then what happened, of course, Turkey, who were quite comfortable with having Islamic State on their border, now had the Kurds, who they actually classify as a terrorist organization, and then built the wall, as you see below. So this presents a small problem. You know, we cannot now visit our project, which was in a straight line 20k, 20 minutes drive, and you could see it in a different country. But because of the change in context, the change in the occupying force, even though we may consider Daesh as a greater threat than the Kurds, and when they say the Kurds, the Turks mean the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, even though they weren't necessarily. They tar everybody with the same brush at the time, and it was just a security threat. They closed the borders. So we're stuck. You know, when we knew this was happening, everybody came back. The clinic stayed working. It only stayed working with Syrian staff, and all of the staff who were managing it, who were some Turks as well, all had to return, and we could only manage it from Turkey. Now, this is not a good long-term solution. Let's face it. It certainly isn't. It's not manageable. We need to move on. So the two key gentlemen there, we have Masoud Barzani as the president and Karim Sinjari, the Minister of Interior and head of Peshmerga. This was by chance. A gentleman who we got to know very well was a well-connected doctor in Istanbul. His uncle was Karim Sinjari. He managed to connect me to go and meet with Mr. Sinjari on a Saturday morning and drink tea with him, who's one of the most senior leaders in Kurdistan, in northern Iraq at the time, because we identified this as an option to get into the country. He granted access. He allowed us, and as you can see below, to then make that journey from our small towns in Turkey to fly into Iraq, in Erbil, and then take a 700-kilometer overland journey through northern Syria to get to that project. What took 20 minutes has now taken best part of 3 days, but we had access. And of course, the vehicles crossing the Tigris above, again, that's the way we managed to do it. Again, it's all about our contacts. It was a bizarre situation, but ultimately we found access, and that's the way it had to be. So Kobane, we continued to rehabilitate the hospitals. We provided support to mobile teams, and we responded to the changes in the context as well. That's what we had to do. I'm going to move on because I'm just seeing that time is not exactly with me at the moment. It's 8:20. I just really want to finish a little bit on, I think, is highly topical and something that not a lot of people are aware of, is the UK's Office COVID-19 response. I've got a short video and just a few slides, and then we can hopefully wrap up and I can answer any questions that may be coming in. I just want to define the rationale because, of course, this is a very different type of intervention that MSF does. I review our operational response, and then just give you a short 3 minutes only video of how we did it, because I think it's fascinating. We had a couple of statements we framed really on how we supported this. We best use our resources and experiences to make them available to contribute to the mechanisms that are in place, i.e., we don't go alone, we join someone else. We find something that's working and we help them. And the idea was it could be through the NHS or civil society-led initiatives. This was our mission statement. This is how we would engage. Our field staff have the skills. Imagine them working in Ebola with infection prevention control, and they're experienced at working at fast-moving situations at emergency levels. This was the mindset we brought to the UK context. We had the table, NHS Homeless Sector Plan, St John Ambulance, advice for the NHS operations and research, community of practice, crisis, the homeless shelter organisation, and care homes. And in the end of these options, we selected the NHS Homeless Sector Plan. We started to initiate the response in March, and we started operations in April. We had an MOU signed. We had 50 patients approximately, and we started to review and reflect that programme and eventually closed down in June 2020. And again, it followed the curve. That's exactly what we did. There was no point keeping it open. And of course, the main client group were rough sleepers and homeless people in the London area. So I just would like to share with you quickly a short audio visual if I can. This is where I get it all wrong, isn't it? Bear with me. Right. Sorry about that.
So at COVID Care here in London, we treat patients with COVID-19 who are experiencing homelessness, I guess with a twofold purpose. One is actually decreasing the risk of transmission, so allowing people to safely isolate. But secondly, providing an environment where we can monitor patients on a regular basis to make sure that they don't deteriorate. And if they do get sicker, they're able to be referred into hospital in time. UCLH are leading, MSF are providing medical staff, and there's other organizations such as Thames Reach who are actually managing the housing and accommodation at the center. MSF here is helping staff the project, so we can currently accommodate between 40 and 60 patients if required, and we have about 3 to 4 nurses in the daytime and 2 at night. In addition to that, we are also helping support infection prevention and control and keeping this center running, using a lot of the experience we have from the field.
I've only ever done emergency missions, so I stepped into this one with that frame of mind, realising that there wasn't going to be anything set up in advance, so it was going to be a very hands-on job with trying to get everything from infection control through to just living conditions and storage, and trying to make sure that the MSF engine here is running. For day-to-day, for the rounds, it will be surgical mask, the face shields, gloves, gowns, aprons, scrubs, you know, all the usual sorts of PPE items that you would find in a hospital setting.
In my previous submissions, I have had experience of epidemic interventions. We go around and do nurses rounds, so we go around checking our patients, making sure they're okay, they're not having any symptoms from COVID, checking observations, which is really important, especially their oxygen levels, because that will really tell us if they are in a good condition or not. That can take us a couple of hours to do that, not because it's work intensive, but because it's all the cleaning between the patients, because of the risk of infection.
When you talk to your teams in the field and people talk about doing this and helping, you know, their community and their families and their country, and you know, you accept it, you can see it, but then sort of being in that position where, to a certain extent, you're doing that. It's just a humbling place to stand, I think, within it all. I mean, with the level of the crisis and stepping in and doing what we're doing, it's very similar to an emergency setup if you're coming in with the first wave. I think the biggest shock or the biggest difference being is that you never
Starting a new project is never easy, and especially when you repurpose a center to be able to take care of patients with a specific set of needs. This is a unique time in the world when things that none of us imagine would happen in our lifetimes are actually coming to pass. There was a gap, and as MSFers with experience in outbreaks who couldn't currently deploy to other places in missions as well, it was a good thing that we were able to put our experience to use in our home base.
Bear with me 1 second. I'll just go back to the last slides. So that was a small project we ran last year. I was the coordinator for that, and we closed that down in July. But one thing it did do, it established a very strong working relationship with UCLH, University College London Hospital, to prep for the next wave. And currently, because of the model that was set up, it was easy to scale up and scale down again. And that's exactly what's just happened in the last 6 weeks. They've just done just that. This time, they could do it themselves because the structures were set up in place. As often they said, the biggest strength we brought to that mission, that project, was our logistical capacity, our ability to put the right systems in place quickly and fast. And basically, they've been doing our vaccination and COVID care, which is the facility. And we're working with the UCLH Find and Treat TB teams, vaccinating rough sleepers in London at the moment. And I put down Southwest because I'm also in conversation with some of our public health colleagues in the area about how we might also provide certain expertise on vaccinations to large populations, homeless groups, and also the more logistical support for COVID care. Because there's always a question people ask, so why London? And it's true. And I don't live in London, I'm local here. So I started to engage with public health leaders in the Southwest and mainly Bristol, and certainly giving advice and tips on how we managed to run a successful COVID intervention in London. So I'm going to bring it to a close now. We've done 3 field scenarios, and I just wanted to add that last 5-6 minutes on COVID because it's incredibly relevant, and it also shows the flexibility of MSF, the way we can adjust to suit the conditions and the context, and I think this is a classic example. So I will move on to my last slide. I will stop sharing my screen, and I will leave it there and hand back to Penny.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. It's been really fascinating, and it's a huge wake-up call to hear how MSF has the relevant experience and logistical capacity to advise meaningfully within the United Kingdom context as well. Now, I'm going to start to read off some of the questions that have come in. There are going to be loads of questions. We'll handle them as best we can. And I'll take the first that have come in. Right. One of the first questions has come from Paula Risborough. These are all such difficult and often distressing situations. Do Médecins Sans Frontières staff have regular debriefing and sessions and pastoral care?
It's to be honest, and I'll just share with you, when supporters are asked about where sometimes they want their money to go, as well as medicines, it is to support our teams in the field. It is, they realize that. People don't do prolonged time in the field. Often, you'll have a finite amount of time and you'll be told you have to leave. i.e. you return, you leave the mission, you get out of the country, you decompress to come back in. So you don't do prolonged periods at a time. The conditions that I showed in South Sudan, yeah, we have moved on quite significantly from there. So options for R&R exist. That still happens. We do have our own, as well as having mental health and psychological support for patients, we need to do it for our own staff as well. So there are those resources available from within the organization. Debriefing, yes, of course, that happens extensively in either, for me, it happens in Amsterdam and then in London, so I can feed back there. But also it's the job mainly of the project coordinator or the head of mission. You identify these signs early. You make sure that, people take breaks as and when they need, because you can sometimes just not see it. You can get carried away. So yes, there is space to relax. And we shouldn't feel guilty about it sometimes, but it's also about getting out, R&R, being able to leave the project, get it out of your head and come back in maybe a week later. So those provisions are always provided for. Yeah.
Thank you. On to the next question. This is a question from Paul Jackson. It is staggering what MSF does. Can you comment on the policy for providing aid in active war zones? For example, what proportion of aid is MSF prepared to see diverted to belligerent factions or paid as bribes to get the aid through to where is it needed?
I'm not sure I should answer that question. No, it's okay. We all say we don't pay bribes, and Médecins is not a way of bribery. I mentioned a little bit in the comment earlier when I said people sometimes ask to take a balanced approach. So you provide healthcare here to get to there. Sometimes you have to make that decision. If you realize you're providing a clinic for a community who doesn't really need it, but the perception is you need to do it because they see it as a balanced approach and fair approach, even though you see it as it's not very impartial. It really isn't. You're not providing it to those who need it. It's a hard decision to take. And I think these days we're having to come more and more to actually absorb that a little bit. Bribes, I think I should say no, first and foremost. I have to. That's my job. But behind the scenes, of course, tea money. Let's call it tea money. That happens in certain contexts. Of course it does. You're expected to do certain things and follow traditions. If you're arrested by a policeman in a certain part of the world, if you don't pay a certain amount of money on the first arrest, you could find yourself, in jail for 4 years for an erroneous offence. So there's certain practices that yes, we would take and we will adhere to. Bribes, as in large costs, large payments of money, no. That's something we don't do. We don't do that, and we also don't pay ransoms, etc. We don't get involved into those difficult positions. It could be precedent setting for us. So, no.
Thank you. Now, next question. Yes, although I have supported, this is a question from Jenny's iPhone. Although I have supported and respected MSF for years, I had no idea it was so far-reaching. I'm also interested to learn you turned to working at home in the COVID crisis. So thank you again. Do you have any comment to make on turning towards offering help during the COVID crisis in Britain?
I think the thing is with this, it was the rationale was we felt comfortable doing it because we were responding to a neglected group. It was homeless and rough sleepers. We thought, let's go here. Care homes was also one at the time last year when it was becoming it was disastrous. The response was awful. To be honest, some of the responses that you saw, we see in other countries that we work in. And actually, I feel at the end of the day, if there's a need and we have the resources, then I feel we were justified in responding. And I know in North America and in Belgium, there were huge care home interventions in COVID because they were neglected, they were left off the chart. Now, I hope everybody's learned lessons now, and I know that our NHS colleagues and ourselves work together very well. And we just brought a little bit of different expertise to it, should we say. It was that fast-paced scale-up that I think they wanted. We cut through the bureaucracy, which was quite nice to see. It was different, and I think it might be that we have to accept, more and more of this, where we work in higher income countries. You know, it's just, I think it's going to happen more and more. So.
Thank you. I have one question that I would like to ask you. And when you were talking about your experiences within Myanmar, and you alluded to how important the use of social media had been in stirring up opposition and hostility towards MSF, I wonder, to what extent does MSF do a sort of counter presentation and use social media to dispel fake news and to put your side of the situation?
I had exactly the same conversation 9 years ago in a training in Amsterdam, and it was around this: should we push back on this comment, or should we just stand back and let it go? At that time, we stood back, but the thing is, it built to a point where I don't also think we appreciated the context. It's a country where most people get their news from Facebook. They assume it's correct, you know, and if that's it, it's their only news source. I think in certain places where there's greater access to news sources, then it's less of a problem. But there, everybody believed what they picked up. 60% of the population or something had access to it. So you could see its spread was huge. We did not do it. And I think looking back, we realized that was probably a mistake. We now have Facebook pages established throughout missions. We're fully now engaged on the social media network. And I think at some times, I think we would have felt we would have benefited from a stronger proactive pushback at times on that one. But I think the point is, it highlighted what people felt about the organization as well, because we were treating one group and not fully respecting the other. So in a way, we thought, well, let's try and address that issue and engage with communities, when the reality is, yes, we should have probably raised it more on a social media platform. So that's a fair point, Pam.
Thank you. A question from David Haywood. On the medical side, are any of your doctors full-time MSF doctors, or do doctors from many countries dip in and out to MSF? And if so, for how long?
Yeah, doctors tend to, because they often will do 2 or 3 missions. A mission length maybe 9 months in duration, and then they can return, often wherever their home is, continue working and come back into the field. You tend to get the management, shall we say, the senior management, the medical coordinators, those type of positions. And what is a real benefit is to have doctors or nurses moving into the positions like I was in, the head of mission position. To have someone with a medical background in that position is a real bonus. You know, you walk into a meeting with a lot of experience, and you can advocate from any angle. You're not just there on the political side and the advocacy side. You're there also on the patients. You can talk about it. Some people do stay for a long period of time. They do run contracts which can run for 3 years now, I understand. Vocational contracts, they call it. But doctors and the medical teams, they tend to come and go, mainly probably because they can find work more easily back in their home country, whereas for myself, coming back into the UK, often find it difficult to find something remotely similar, which is why I ended up back in MSF UK in a very different type of capacity. But normally the average mission length is about 9 months, and I think on average people in most roles do 2 to 3 missions, and then I guess we've all got our own lives and we've got families, etc., that we also have to pay attention to. So.
Thank you. A message from Meg. Can you say something about the impact of COVID on the MSF managers, their ability to maintain continuity of oversight to ongoing projects in the field?
Of course, COVID has entered all of our overseas programs. Yeah, of course, to certain degrees and certain levels, depending on where we are. It's had a complex nature to management. I don't necessarily think it's affected the continuity, shall we say, of our staff. I don't, and I haven't been aware of anybody particularly who has had to cut their mission short or has no longer been available for field work, shall we say. So I don't necessarily feel it's affected the continuity. It's affected the way we work, absolutely. But then again, we have come from Ebola contexts and environments, which are obviously a little bit further down the line. So, and we also work in environments where remote management is normal. So it's just another way of working. But yes, we have built COVID into most of our overseas missions, yeah.
Thank you. Keris Humphreys has asked, and probably intrigued by your labeling on the screen, and she asked, could you say a little about MSF's activities in India?
No, sure. They've also had a COVID response in India, actually. We had a hospital there. MSF in India, it's we used to have programming up in Kashmir region. Now, obviously, that is not necessarily India, depends what side of the border you come from. Mainly mental health programming, yeah. And a lot of the programming in India does come is mental health programming. They're setting up and sexual violence. That tends to be the core activities. It's not big, we don't have a huge presence operationally there, but what we do have is a large institutional presence. There's an office, it's the hub. Delhi is the hub for recruitment, for learning and development. A lot of training sessions come out of there. We have scientific conferences being managed from there. That and the communications hub as well. So India adds a lot more than just pure operations. The operations are a small part, but they focus mainly on sexual violence and mental health programming.
Thank you. Just check for any more questions that have just come in. Right, I have a question I would like to ask, and you talked about the need for advocacy, obviously with the governance of the countries in which you're working, but what is the role of education? Is there any opportunity to educate the patients themselves in the what MSF can and cannot offer?
Absolutely. If you could picture the scene, you have for instance, one of my first missions was in Darfur 14 years ago during the war, and we used to run mobile clinics in small places, and I went on every mobile clinic. So I had to set up the clinic, take it down, get it reset up. And we had a doctor, and we had a Sudanese team with us, and a Fur team. And one of the key tasks because as soon as people see you coming to town, the queues build, as you can imagine, and there's people everywhere, and it's because of course healthcare is free, and of course you're applying reliable drugs with good quality doctors, etc. The point is, you have a row of people, 50, 100 people long. you have a captive audience. So what do we do there? We train a lot of the local staff to provide key healthcare messaging. So our education that we will provide is mainly revolved around health education, educators. It's around hygiene, it's sexual health messaging, it's that sort of thing. So while people are actually there waiting to be seen, to have a consultation, groups will be taken away. We'll discuss on health and hygiene, good sanitation practice, you know, all of these healthcare messages. So that's something that's built into a lot of programming. It's an example on how we can, yeah, I mean, it's built into other parts, but it's one that springs to my mind. And it certainly is integral into most of our programs, yeah.
Right. I think we have a few more minutes, which we can pick up on. I have a question, and that is, there has been some very well publicized episodes of disgraceful behavior from individuals within international non-governmental organizations. How has this, if at all, affected the work of MSF, bearing in mind that you're operating in extremely sensitive circumstances politically?
Absolutely. No, and I can only, yeah, I think we're referring back to maybe 3 years ago. And MSF is not immune. Let's face it, we are not. We've got to stand up and accept that there were problems. There's problems within the sector. A light was shone within the humanitarian sector. Abuse of power happens in certain places, of course. So how do we overcome that? We have set up, as most of the charity sector have now, specific safeguarding routes, places also where people can confidentially share grievances, because we think we had in the past, but the reality is a little bit different sometimes. You know, people need to be explained that you can actually voice concerns if you have them. And it's true. I think it's a self-reflection that actually, yes, we weren't immune to it. It did happen. It has happened. We can't hide. We need to acknowledge it, and we are a charity. We're accountable. We have to make sure that we provide the best and safest place for all staff and patients and donors. Therefore, and also give them the opportunity, if they feel that the services are not sufficient or they haven't been treated right, they have a place to safely voice their concerns. And then, of course, yeah, we need certainly robust methods and systems to be able to address these. So I know each individual office has designated staff, shall we say, now installed. I know the UK office, I'll talk about the UK because I'm acutely aware of it. And of course, acutely aware of the discussions we have with the Charity Commission over this. So therefore, we put in measures to make sure that, yeah, staff felt they had space to ventilate, that they felt they could also share grievances if they came. So there are particular positions now within offices and missions. Yeah, and we had to make sure that we do protect all our staff. Abuse of power is probably the biggest problem, and you can sometimes see it happening without even recognizing it sometimes, and that's the danger. So.
Thank you. Simon, we're going to be within about 5 minutes of going off air, but as I don't spot any immediate questions coming up, I wanted to just quote back to you a quote from Dr. James Orbinski, your former MSF president, where he said, "We're not sure that words can always save lives, but we do know that silence can certainly kill." Has there been a time in your experience when silence saved lives?
I'll mention, I'll go back to the case study, because the reason that created problems internally for MSF, and we have reflected on that numerous occasions, is we felt we should probably have been more vocal towards the treatment of Rohingya in Rakhine State. That was clear. You know, the persecution, the problems, I used to see it on a daily basis. But when I spoke to our staff about it, and I said, guys, look, we could stand up there. We could start to really advocate for you. But I said, you do realize what might happen if we did. We could be thrown out of the country. Now, the fact is we've suspended and ever. But, and then everybody thinks, oh, well, if you're not here, who's there to witness what's going on anyway? Could it be a worse situation? So, and also because of our staff who were detained, we felt we couldn't raise our voice maybe as we might have done because of the consequences. We did our own analysis and we felt the consequences might have been too great. We didn't feel like comfortable doing it at that time. But we look back now and think, okay, it's wonderful with hindsight, and now seeing, you know, the disastrous situation where people moved into Bangladesh. But at that time, that was unknown. We thought, you know, citizenship was coming, but it wasn't. And it's one that we reflect on. And the nice thing about MSF is we do that. That was a case study that we do reflect on hugely. And it has split people. People have just, there's two camps. One said we should have just said everything and voiced out the concerns, but the consequences were we wouldn't be there, and then offer informal protection for a community and people that actually, because we were present, we offered, it was a very much a humanitarian mission rather than a pure medical mission. So that will, I'm not actually probably saying it saved anything. I wouldn't know the outcomes particularly. And it's very difficult to know sometimes if you've had a positive impact because you just don't know what the alternatives would have been, shall we say. But each case is assessed, you know, for its merits and what are the benefits, one to the people you're serving, and how do they feel? Because there's one thing as an organization which we feel keeps us apart, and it's that témoignage, the bearing witness, the advocacy is one thing, but we can only do it if it does actually have a positive outcome to our patients. So yeah.
Well, I think we've more or less got to the end of our session, but I just want to thank you most warmly for such an open and willingness on your part to answer all and every question that was thrown at you, for sharing your insights with the 3 case studies, for surprising us with the COVID delivery, COVID care delivery within London, and for opening our minds to the many challenges and dilemmas that project management and the delivery of humanitarian aid poses for project managers. And we wish you well in your future missions, and have really nothing more to say then. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all our audience for their intelligent and perceptive questions and attentive listening. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Penny. It's lovely to share and share time with you all. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.